Hello and welcome to MEE Live. I'm Matilda Mallinson. It's Thursday, the 26th of March, 2026. Today, will Trump hit Cuba next? Ground invasion by US troops, regime change from the sky. This is the uncertainty facing a population whose country has been plunged into darkness by US President Donald Trump. No, not Iran, Cuba.
I do believe I'll be having the honor of taking Cuba. That'd be good. That's a big honor.
Taking Cuba.
Taking Cuba in some form, yeah. Taking Cuba. I mean, whether I free it, take it, I think I could do anything I want with it. You want to know the truth? They're a very weakened nation.
Since January, the US has held Cuba under a near-total oil blockade, building on years of escalating sanctions under Trump that have seen Cuba's infant mortality rate more than double. Under these strained conditions, talks are underway between the Trump administration and that of Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel. It's unclear what's at stake here. But Trump's intentions are seen as an extension of his Donroe Doctrine, an adapted 19th century foreign policy that aggressively asserts US primacy in the Western Hemisphere. This included the abduction of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in January and the installation of a more compliant leader from the same government who immediately signed an oil supply deal with Trump. Trump also provided a $20 billion bailout to Argentinian President Javier Milei in exchange for preferential access to critical minerals. Trump says he wants to take Cuba. US presidents have persistently sought to depose Cuba's communist leadership since the Cold War. They have never succeeded. But with Iran under bombardment and Venezuela's Maduro facing trial in New York today, the lengths to which Trump is willing to go are causing serious anxiety as well as serious human devastation. This is the account of James Schneider in a feature published on MEE today, written upon return from a civilian convoy that delivered 35 tons of aid to the besieged nation. He joins me now. Welcome, James, to MEE Live. Tell us, what was the purpose of the Nuestra America convoy?
We had a twin purpose. The first was to gather up as much aid as we possibly could from people of good conscience and organizations of good conscience from around the world. And we were able to bring around 35 tons of critically needed aid, from medicines that are urgently needed, cancer drugs, pain relief, antibiotics, to non-perishable foods, nutritional supplements, vitamins for children, and solar panels and batteries needed to keep the lights on in hospitals and clinics. And we were able to do that. There were hundreds of delegates came from dozens of countries around the world bringing this aid. Some came by boat, some by charter flight, and some packed in suitcases of travelers. But it also had a secondary purpose, which was to show the Cuban people that they are not alone, that the majority of the peoples of the world stand with them against the violence done to them by the Trump administration. And we had traveling with us, of course, people from many countries that are opposed to US actions, but many from the US itself, including Cuban Americans for Cuba, who were showing that while the media in the US likes to show the reactionary Cuban exiles and their political positions, that there are a huge number of ordinary Cuban Americans that want to see friendship between the two peoples and are completely opposed to the violence that is done to their relatives, to their families across the Straits of Florida.
Now, speaking of what you describe as the reactionary Cuban Americans, I'm sure you're aware that the convoy has come under some criticisms. Can I just fire a few at you so that you can have a chance
Please
to hit
do.
back? Trump's trying to force out an authoritarian government. Why are you lot helping it to resist?
What the US administration is doing, and successive administrations have been doing, is a gross crime, is clearly illegal, and is voted to be illegal by the vast majority, almost unanimous states every single year at the UN Security Council. Regardless of what you think of how other people decide to run their own country, no state in the world should be allowed to strangle another state. So Some people on the mission are great supporters of the Cuban model. Others are critics of the Cuban model. But the basic point is that an entire population should not be starved as an act of collective punishment on the whims of US imperial policy. And that's what we're seeing happening. And it's so clearly wrong, which is why if you look at polling that we Progressive International released at the back end of last week, the vast majority of US Americans do not support their own government's policy attacking the island.
Another criticism, James, you guys, or a lot of your team, stayed in luxury hotels with private generators while many Cubans are starving and in darkness. What's up with that?
Well, that's US government policy. US policy to the sanctions mean that US Americans, and as I said, we had a large number of US Americans on our delegation, are only allowed to stay at a very small number of hotels. And these hotels are the ones which keep the lights on when there is a complete grid failure and blackout, because the US sanctions only allow in a small amount of fuel to private businesses, which means that by definition, caused by US policy, the only place where delegates from the US can stay are in these hotels. And these hotels, because of US policy, are the only ones with the lights left on.
Okay, now let's talk about some of what you saw when you were actually there. When you were there, did you experience one of the rolling blackouts that has been caused by this oil blockade? And how did Cubans around you react when plunged into sudden darkness?
Yes, there was a complete grid failure on Saturday, late afternoon, early evening. Fortunately, it was still light. It wasn't quite yet dusk when this happened. And I write about that in the piece just published on Middle East Eye. The response to people is immediate. They know that they have to get home before dark. They need to go and pick up their children, and that they need to deal with quite basic things like food. If how long is the refrigerator going to be out for? What food do they need to find ways to cook quickly, and by what light? So that it doesn't spoil. People respond and act very quickly. And of course, it's eerie being in a city which is entirely dark, but still walking down the streets, you could still sometimes hear a bit of music from a stereo, the odd person still, dancing in their home. So while it is a very difficult time, life still goes on amid the darkness.
It's hard to imagine. I mean, I live in London, living in an urban centre, being plunged into darkness. You would think that could be instant anarchy. You visited hospitals while you were there. What did you witness in the hospitals?
I'll come to the hospitals in a minute, but just on your point about anarchy, the streets still seemed safe despite being mainly deserted when it was dark. There was no sense of fear or danger there. And it didn't feel like society had collapsed. Of course, the infrastructure had collapsed. They're being strangled. But society went on, and that was fantastic to see. And we saw...
Because that wouldn't happen in London. Do you think that there's a particularly strong sense of social cohesion? I assure you that in London, if it was plunged into darkness, you wouldn't have that reaction. How do you explain that the fact that the streets still feel very, very safe, or relatively safe in darkness?
The Cuban people have faced 67 years of blockade and different attempts to bring hardship to them as a US government policy. When I say hardship, that's a direct quote from a 1960 US State Department memo. That is the purpose of US government policy, to bring hardship to the Cuban people. They are, by definition, by necessity, incredibly resilient, and are not about to fall apart. Their society isn't about to fall apart because of the latest round of hardship. Now, that doesn't mean that what they're experiencing isn't incredibly painful. Infant mortality since Trump came back in the first time and made US policy more aggressive towards Cuba. Infant mortality has more than doubled.
And that brings us to the hospitals. Tell us about the hospitals.
Yes, that brings us to the hospitals. And I'm sure there are patients who in each blackout die and would not have died otherwise. Clearly lives are being taken by this, and each one of those is a tragedy, and people feel that very keenly. But still, on these hospitals I went to the Salvador Allende Hospital in Havana to see a delivery from the Puerto Rican delegation of medicines for that hospital. Now, that hospital has sent medical delegations, medical brigades of Cuban doctors to 41 countries around the world. The director, Dr. Vasquez, who spoke to us, she herself had served in Pakistan. And she was saying that the Cuban people want to give to the world and have been giving to the world for decades and decades. When Ebola broke out in West Africa, it was Cuban doctors who were immediately on the front line. When COVID broke out and it was ripping through Italy, it was Cuban doctors who turned up to help. And it was quite moving, I have to say, to see this Puerto Rican delegation, Puerto Rico still a colony of the United States, turning up with this medical aid to repay that favor to the Cuban people, not because it's a debt that needs to be paid, but it's a basic act that asserts that all humans are human beings and we can live in freedom with each other.
And James, did you come across any Cubans while you were there who had a different view, who were hopeful that Trump's approach could pressure a democratic transition in Cuba?
I have to say, I didn't speak to anybody who was in favor of Trump attacking the country. Of course, there will be, I imagine, a small minority of people who, after so many years of hardship, will hope for something different. Many Cubans look back, who I've spoken to on this trip and on previous trips, look back at the opening within the Obama era, where relations between the US and Cuba improved. US tourists were able to come to the island as a golden era in many ways, and would like to go back to that. Of course, in the same thing you see in Iran, there are some people in Iran who, for some reason, think that being bombed and having their regime changed by the US and by Trump and Netanyahu is somehow going to bring a good outcome. Of course, there will be a small number in Cuba, but that's not what I saw, and that from the people that I spoke to, that was not the spirit that I felt in the streets and at the events we were at.
James Schneider, thank you for sharing your experiences with us. You can read about it in full at middleeasteye.net. James Schneider is a political organizer and communications director at Progressive International. James, thank you for your time. The US embargo plunging Cubans into darkness is roundly condemned by the UN General Assembly as an affront to state sovereignty. Nevertheless, some Cubans have welcomed it and expressed hope it could bring needed political change. This view has been most vocally expressed within Cuba's US diaspora, many of whom were forced to flee their country due to political persecution. Under Cuba's one-party rule, dissidents, journalists and activists have faced arbitrary detention, surveillance and harassment. Protests have been met with mass arrests. The party has also overseen decades of chronic food and medicine shortages and stagnant foreign investment. But so have crippling US sanctions. The current embargo, which pinpoints nationalized infrastructure, is crippling Cuba's healthcare sector, which is free and universal for all. Children's ventilators are being struck with rolling blackouts. Meanwhile, privatized luxury hotels, as James Schneider just told us, are exempt to Trump's oil ban. Cuba is a communist state in capitalist America's backyard. Is Trump's policy in Cuba really about anything more than Cold War ideology? Yes, say the Center for a Free Cuba, a Washington, D.C.-based human rights NGO. Let's hear why. John Suarez is the center's executive director. John, thank you for joining me on MEE Live. What's your view of Trump's embargo of Cuba?
Well, it's not Trump's embargo of Cuba. I think there's been a policy in place for 67 years, which has been called the embargo. It has not been a static policy until March 12th of 1996, when it was codified following the Brothers to the Rescue shootdown, which took place on February 24th of 1996. But even then, it has changed. For example, this past year, the United States businesses, agricultural businesses, sold over $800 million in agricultural and other products to Cuba, which was one of the largest years ever in 2025 alone. What has occurred with Trump's policies, especially since January 3rd, is he has announced, beginning in December of 2025, a shift in the position of the United States towards the Western Hemisphere. So there's a national security document that came out in December of 2025. Then there was a Defense Department document that came out in January after the taking of Maduro. And there was a presidential executive order in January which declared Cuba a unusual and malign threat in the hemisphere, and it outlined the Cuban regime's history and continuing relationship with a number of hostile actors towards the United States. Now, in that policy announcement in December of 2025, it didn't just include Cuba, it mentions Venezuela, Nicaragua, and sort of makes a blanket statement throughout the region in terms of countries that have relations with China, Russia, Iran, groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, etc. And that's what's motivating this oil blockade that began.
Right, so it's not just about Cuba in your mind, it's more about the threat to America's interest in the Western Hemisphere?
That's what they announced with what is taking place now, the oil blockade that began on January 29th, which, by the way, the Trump administration now, as of February 25th, in the Department of Treasury, said that they are resuming the sale of oil to Cuba, but through private enterprises in Cuba.
Right, which doesn't include hospitals. You know, so for a policy that may not be designed to target Cuba, as you point out, it is heavily impacting Cubans, particularly patients in hospitals who are experiencing rolling blackouts. So, given that is the consequence of this policy, how do you feel about this policy?
Hold on. No. Let me dispute that, though. The rolling there are two things that are taking place. There's been a cutoff in oil, which will be should have been running out within a few days or weeks' time. The rolling blackouts are due to a electric grid that's been collapsing in Cuba for a number of years because the Cuban government has not invested in it for decades. Most recently in 2015, Moscow offered $1.38 billion, I believe, to help rebuild that grid. And the Cuban government said they had other priorities.
So would you dispute that? Would you dispute that the oil blockade? Would you dispute that the oil blockade is creating an energy crisis in hospitals in Cuba?
What I'm saying is that the rolling blackouts are not due to the oil blockade. The rolling blackouts and the nationwide blackouts, there have been 8 of them, most of them before January, has been due to a collapsing electrical grid that has been due to a lack of upkeep going back decades.
Okay,
That's what's causing the rolling blackouts and also the 8 nationwide blackouts that have been taking place over the last 5 years.
Okay, so what is your view of the oil blockade? Do you view that as a positive or as a negative for Cuba, for Cubans?
Well, I think it's obviously a negative. I think it can be a negative because over the next few weeks or months, it can have a negative impact on Cubans in the island, definitely. Apparently, they're using it as a leveraging tool in these negotiations they have underway. However, the other part of it is, in terms of the rolling blackouts, the food security issues, 70 to 80% of Cuba's food is imported, most of it coming from the United States. The chicken that Cubans are eating today comes from Mississippi and Alabama. Now, Cuban farmers that could be producing chicken in Cuba, if they try to sell it directly to other Cubans, wind up in prison. Now, that's not the oil blockade or the U.S. embargo. That's the Cuban government's centralized economic planning that does not permit farmers to sell directly to other Cubans. They have to sell it to something called an acopio. And the problem with the acopio system is that upwards of 50% of the food that's produced either doesn't get picked up on time or sits in government's warehouses and rots. And you end up with a situation where the Cuban government is actually importing a good chunk of the food that Cubans are eating from the United States, Brazil, but predominantly the United States. Okay, and Cuban farmers who try to farm and go to market wind up in prison. They're in prison today.
You mentioned these talks then between the Cuban and American governments. What would you like to see come from these talks?
Oh, what I think the first and foremost is hopefully allow farmers to farm, free all the political prisoners in Cuba, including the farmers, that are currently imprisoned. That'd be one great thing. But the Cuban government, and as I said, there are two different things here. We're talking about the policy that the White House has been pushing since December of this past year. And then you mentioned the embargo. The embargo was codified in March 12th of 1996. That has three conditions for it to be lifted immediately. They are freeing of all political prisoners, restoration of civil and political liberties on the island, and a pledge somewhere down the line to hold free elections. Those three conditions are met. The embargo is lifted today. Now, the other issues that this administration has brought up is they're talking about national security concerns, and they outline it in the presidential executive order that came out on January 29th that also had the issue of tariffing other countries that ship oil to Cuba. And that's where they're talking about the relationships with Tehran, Moscow, Beijing, groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. And one of the things that came out of the taking of Nicolas Maduro on January 3rd was that although Cuba had denied it for years, his internal security ring was made up of Cuban intelligence and Cuban military officials. And estimates from the OAS Secretary General a couple years ago placed it as, I believe it was 20,000 Cubans that they expect to be operating as an occupying force in Venezuela. And that's created a humanitarian crisis, including the extrajudicial killing of 7,000 Venezuelans under the Chavez Maduro regimes.
You're right to point out that the embargo is not a new context, but Trump's presidency, and particularly since January, has brought in a series of escalating measures that have led to or have pressured the talks we're now seeing. Trump is also going on air and talking about taking Cuba. People in Cuba are afraid. Many people in Cuba are concerned that there could be bombs dropped on Cuba, that there could be a ground invasion in the context of Trump's actions, not just in Venezuela, but in Iran. How do you feel about Trump's rhetoric, about the escalation that Trump has been demonstrating he's willing to do? If this came to an invasion of Cuba, how would you feel about it? Can I just get clarity on exactly how you feel about Trump's escalating aggression towards Cuba and its state sovereignty?
Well, the Center for a Free Cuba has, since 1997, been advocating for nonviolent change in Cuba. Obviously, we do not desire a military invasion of Cuba or bombing of Cuba, etc. And we're also concerned, obviously, when it comes to the situation of Iran, that if you're going to be in the United States, there are a number of things you need to do, according to the Constitution, when you're going to wage war. And that's consulting with Congress, explaining the reasons for this, and that was something that was not done in the case of the war in Iran. So, I mean, yes, there are obviously concerns about how the administration is conducting itself in its international policies.
Now, US governments have for many years tried to achieve a change of leadership in Cuba. Do you think that Trump will succeed where they have not? Do you think that Trump will force a change of leadership in Cuba?
I don't know. Well, the Trump administration, what's been rumored is that they want to see a change in the presidency of Miguel Díaz-Canel. I mean, again, I don't speak for the administration. I'm basing this on what I'm seeing in press accounts. What has been rumored is that they want to see Miguel Díaz-Canel replaced. Now, the folks that are actually running Cuba is the Castro family and the Cuban military. So if Miguel Díaz-Canel is replaced with someone else, that doesn't mean that you have some sort of change of system. If we go back, this July is going to be the 5-year anniversary of the 11J nationwide protests in Cuba. And Cubans were calling for freedom, for democracy. Having the head of this regime change for someone else and having the regime continue, I don't think will satisfy Cubans inside the island who want a democratic opening, or Cubans in the diaspora.
John Suarez, Executive Director of the Center for a Free Cuba, thank you for your time. And for today, that is all that we have time for. But before we lose you, we would love to hear from you. Please send in your thoughts and questions to @MiddleEastEye on any social platform or email meelive@middleeasteye.net. We'll be here at 5 p.m. GMT, noon in New York, every Tuesday and Thursday. See you then.